Picture this: a cold, stone cell where prisoners once languished in darkness, their only crime defying the rulers of their time. Now, centuries later, the same walls echo with prayers, the same corridors crowded with pilgrims lighting candles, leaving offerings. How does a place of punishment become a sacred site, a destination for the devout? It's a transformation so profound it feels almost magical, but the real magic lies in the stories we tell. Myths and legends have the power to rewrite history, to take the darkest corners of human experience and spin them into something holy, something hopeful. Today, we're diving into the astonishing journey of ancient prisons reborn as shrines, unraveling how tales of gods, martyrs, and miracles can reshape not just a place, but the way we remember it. Think about the weight of these spaces, once filled with fear, now radiating reverence. What does it say about us that we can look at a dungeon and see divine intervention? It's a testament to the human need to find meaning, to transform suffering into something sacred. Across cultures and centuries, these sites have been reclaimed by folklore, their grim pasts softened by stories of redemption, sacrifice, or celestial visitations. Whether it's a saint who walked these halls or a deity who appeared in a prisoner's darkest hour, these narratives don't just change the story, they change the very air of the place. So how does it happen? How does a prison become a pilgrimage site? The answer lies in the alchemy of belief and storytelling, where history and myth blend until the lines between them blur. Over the next several minutes, we'll explore these extraordinary transformations from the Roman Mamertine prison, where saints were said to convert their captors, to the Turkish dungeon that became a shrine to a mystic's enduring legacy. We'll uncover how legends grow, how they take root in the stones of these places, and why we, as humans, are so drawn to these stories of darkness turned to light. This isn't just about buildings, it's about the stories we choose to tell, and how those stories shape the world we see. Ready to step inside? Let's begin. Myths are more than just stories, they're cultural alchemy, turning leaden history into golden legend. Think about how a tale passed down through generations can soften the edges of a painful past, wrapping trauma in the comforting cloak of divine purpose. This isn't accidental, it's how societies heal. When a prison becomes a shrine, it's not just about plastering over darkness with light, it's about rewriting the narrative of suffering into something transcendent. Take the Roman catacombs, where early Christians were said to hide from persecution. Over time, these underground tunnels weren't just remembered as hideouts, they became sacred spaces, their walls adorned with frescoes of martyrs whose suffering was reframed as spiritual triumph. The stones didn't change, but the stories did, and with them, the way people saw those stones. Why does this happen? Psychologically, humans crave meaning, especially in the face of injustice or brutality. A myth that turns a torturer's dungeon into a saint's final refuge doesn't just honor the dead, it offers a kind of cosmic justice, a reassurance that cruelty doesn't get the last word. Societally, these stories become communal glue, binding people together around shared symbols of resilience. Imagine a prisoner's cell where, according to legend, a miracle occurred. Maybe the chains fell away, or a voice from heaven whispered comfort. Suddenly, that cell isn't a place of despair. It's proof that the divine walks alongside the oppressed. The trauma of history isn't erased, but it's transformed, made bearable by the idea that even suffering can serve a higher purpose. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Mamatine prison, Rome's oldest dungeon. In its damp, sunless cells, enemies of the state once awaited execution. But centuries later, the same space is venerated as the place where the apostles Peter and Paul converted their jailers, a story that turns captors into converts and confinement into a stage for divine intervention. The prison's brutal reality is eclipsed by a narrative of redemption so powerful that pilgrims still kneel there today, touching the walls as if they might brush against holiness itself. That's the power of myth. It doesn't just change how we remember a place, it changes how we feel standing in it. And that brings us to our first case study, where a fortress of fear became a beacon of hope. But that's a story for the next chapter, one where stone and spirit collide in the most unexpected way. Deep beneath the bustling streets of modern Rome lies the Mamertine prison, a place where history and legend collide with startling force. Originally built in the 7th century before the Common Era, this dank, circular chamber was Rome's most feared holding cell for enemies of the state, a pit where condemned men like Jugurtha, the rebel king of Numidia, awaited execution in darkness. The walls seemed to whisper of despair, the air thick with the weight of centuries of suffering. Yet today, visitors don't come to shudder at its brutality, they come to kneel. Because somewhere along the way, this symbol of imperial power became something else entirely, a sacred site where chains were said to fall away by divine hand. The transformation began with a story, one that wrapped the prison's grim reality in the golden light of miracle. According to medieval tradition, this was where Saint Peter himself was held before his crucifixion upside down. Legend says that during his imprisonment, Peter, desperate to baptize his jailers, struck the stone floor with his hand, and a spring miraculously gushed forth. With that water, he converted his captors, turning tormentors into believers. It's a tale that flips the script entirely, no longer a place where authority crushed dissent, but where faith shattered chains. By the 8th century, a church had been built directly above the prison, San Pietro in Carcere, St. Peter in chains. Pilgrims would descend into the dungeon not to mourn, but to touch the very spot where holiness had defied oppression. What's fascinating is how the myth doesn't erase the prison's past, it redeems it. The spring story doesn't pretend the Mamatine was pleasant. It acknowledges the darkness but insists light broke through. That tension between suffering and salvation is what makes the site so powerful. Visitors today can still see the ancient rings where prisoners were shackled, but they're also shown the Peter's Spring, now dry but marked as holy. The narrative doesn't hide the brutality, it transcends it, offering a kind of spiritual alchemy where pain becomes purpose. This reframing had practical effects too. By the Middle Ages, the Mamatine wasn't just a relic. It was a must-see stop on the Roman pilgrimage circuit. Guidebooks of the time directed the faithful here, not to dwell on executions, but to witness where divine power had humbled earthly might. The prison's very architecture was altered to fit the legend. A corridor was carved between the dungeon and a nearby church, literally creating a path from punishment to prayer. Even the chains believed to have bound Peter were venerated as relics, displayed in another basilica nearby. The physical space evolved to serve the story, proving that myths don't just live in words, they reshape stone. But the Mamertine isn't unique in this metamorphosis. Across the Mediterranean, another prison story took an even more unexpected turn. One where a mystic's endurance transformed a fortress of despair into a shrine of hope. And that's where we're headed next. In the shadow of Lyon's modern streets lies a hidden echo of ancient terror, the crypts beneath the Basilica of St. Irenaeus, once Roman dungeons where faith and brutality collided in the year 177. Here, in damp, lightless cells, 48 Christians, men, women, even slaves faced unimaginable torture for refusing to renounce their beliefs. Yet today, the same site draws pilgrims who come not to recoil from horror, but to touch the walls where saints are said to have sung hymns as they died. How did a place of such visceral suffering become a wellspring of reverence? The answer lies in the power of memory, reshaped by stories so potent they turned victims into intercessors and terror into testament. The martyr's ordeal was meticulously documented in a letter from the surviving Christians of Lyon, a text that reads like both courtroom record and sacred script. Blandina, a slave girl, became the story's unlikely hero bound to a stake, her body broken, yet declaring with each blow, "I am a Christian, and no evil happens among us." Her companion, the Bishop Pothinus, died in his cell after public beatings, his last words a prayer for his persecutors. These accounts weren't just histories, they were blueprints for sanctity. By the 4th century, the dungeon's ruins were encased in a shrine, its darkness literally capped by the light of a basilica. The martyrs' suffering wasn't erased, it was enshrined, their pain reframed as victory. Hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, played a key role in this alchemy. As stories of the Lyon martyrs spread, details grew richer, angels comforting the imprisoned, miracles at their executions. Blandina, once a nameless slave, became a bride of Christ in popular devotion, her chains now relics. The dungeon's geography itself was sanctified. The path from prison to execution ground became the Via Sancta, retraced annually in processions where believers walked the martyrs' final steps, not as mourners, but as participants in their triumph. Pain, ritualized, became sacred theater, and the prison stones absorbed the glow of glory. This pattern of political oppression, rewritten as spiritual destiny, repeats across history. Consider the Conciergerie in Paris, a medieval palace turned revolutionary prison where Marie Antoinette awaited execution. By the 19th century, her cell was a pilgrimage site, the Queen's suffering recast as royal martyrdom. Or the Tower of London, where the axe that beheaded Lady Jane Grey is now displayed beside altars to her piety. Each site follows the same arc, violence remembered not as an end, but as a gateway to something transcendent. What does this reveal about us? Perhaps that humanity refuses to let suffering have the final word. When we sanctify these spaces, we're not denying their darkness, we're insisting that even there, meaning can be found. The next chapter in this story takes us east, to a Turkish fortress where a mystic's decades of imprisonment birthed a legend that still draws thousands. But that's a tale where chains become prayer beads and solitude becomes revelation. High in the fortified walls of Istanbul's Blaşany Palace, the Anema's dungeons tell a story of power and piety clashing across centuries. Built by the Byzantines in the 12th century, these windowless cells were designed to break the elite princes, generals, even emperors who fell from grace. Iron shackles still hang from the ceilings, a stark reminder of the dungeon's original purpose, to extinguish hope. Yet walk through these corridors today, and you'll find coins left in crevices, ribbons tied to rusted bars, tokens left by visitors who come not to curse the darkness, but to honor the light that somehow persisted here. How does a place meant to crush dissent become a sanctuary? The answer lies in the stories that outlive the rulers who built these walls. Among the most enduring tales is that of Emperor Isaac Angelos II, imprisoned here after being blinded by his own brother. Medieval chronicles describe his cell as a place of transformation where a broken man, stripped of power, supposedly gained spiritual sight. Local lore insists angels visited him in captivity, turning his physical blindness into divine vision. Over time, Isaac's suffering was recast as sacred endurance, his prison repurposed as a site of pilgrimage. The very chains meant to humiliate him became symbols of unshakable faith, venerated by later generations seeking strength in their own struggles. This narrative alchemy didn't just redeem Isaac, It redeemed the dungeon itself, rewriting tyranny's legacy as one of transcendence. But the Anema's dungeons reveal an even deeper pattern, the way oral tradition softens the edges of oppression. Long after the Byzantine Empire fell, Greek and Turkish communities kept these stories alive through whispered accounts of miracles, tales of nobles who healed fellow prisoners with prayers, or walls that glowed with unearthly light. These weren't just folk tales, they were acts of resistance, reclaiming spaces of terror as proof that cruelty never gets the final word. The dungeon's transformation wasn't orchestrated by clergy or scholars, but by ordinary people who insisted on finding holiness in the rubble of injustice. This phenomenon isn't unique to Byzantium. Consider the Habsburg-era Spielberg fortress in Brno, where Czech nationalists were imprisoned in the 19th century. Today, their cells are national monuments, their suffering reframed as the birth pangs of independence, or the Arsavanj Church in Serbia, built over a Turkish prison where local tradition says Saint Sava appeared to comfort inmates. Each site follows the same arc, pain remembered not as defeat, but as the foundation of something unbreakable. Yet this raises a fascinating question. Does this redemption narrative belong exclusively to Christian traditions? From the Buddhist temples built over ancient Indian royal dungeons to the Sufi shrines marking Ottoman political prisons, cultures worldwide have rewritten these spaces through spiritual lenses. And that leads us to our next chapter, where we'll cross continents to explore how faiths beyond Christianity transformed sites of confinement into beacons of devotion. The stories may differ, but the human impulse remains strikingly the same, to find light where light was never meant to be. East of the Mediterranean, where empires rose and fell like monsoon rains, prisons also underwent this startling metamorphosis, but the script was rewritten through different spiritual lenses. Take India's Gwalior Fort, a sprawling sandstone complex that once held political prisoners under Mughal rule. Today, visitors climb its steep ramparts not to glimpse dungeons, but to touch the walls of the Tele Kar Mandir, a 9th century temple wedged improbably within the fortress walls. Local tradition insists this was no ordinary prison break. Legend tells of a captive queen who dreamt of the warrior goddess Durga, who promised liberation if a shrine were built in her honor. When the queen's chains miraculously shattered at dawn, the victorious Mughal commander awestruck converted her cell into the temple's inner sanctum. Now, the same space where a prisoner once counted hours until execution pulses with the rhythm of bells and chants. Its walls covered not with graffiti of despair, but with devotional murals of the goddess slaying demons. The story's echoes are uncanny, like Peter's Spring in Rome. It's a tale where divine intervention flips the narrative, turning captors into patrons and confinement into consecration. But the parallels run deeper than isolated miracles. Across Southeast Asia, Buddhist traditions reframed imprisonment as spiritual refinement. Thai folklore brims with stories like that of Phra Malai, a monk wrongfully jailed for treason. As the tale goes, his unbroken compassion feeding rats his meager rations. Blessing his jailers so moved the king that the prison was dismantled and a temple erected in its place. The architectural fingerprints of these transformations are telling. Where iron bars once stood, golden Buddha statues now sit in lotus posture, their serene faces illuminated by the same narrow windows that once admitted only slivers of daylight. The prison's layout often remains intact, but its function is inverted. The guard's post becomes an offering table, the exercise yard a meditation garden. This repurposing isn't merely symbolic, it's embedded in the very stones. At Myanmar's Mandalay prison, later rebuilt as a pagoda, the original brickwork was left exposed in sections, not as a reminder of suffering, but as a testament to impermanence. Pilgrims tracing their fingers over the weathered mortar are invited to reflect not on cruelty, but on the Buddha's teachings about enduring hardship with equanimity. Even the shackles displayed as relics take on new meaning, no longer tools of oppression. They're presented as metaphors for the chains of desire that enlightenment breaks. What unites these stories, from Durga's cell to the monk's redeemed prison, is a shared human instinct to sanctify struggle through narrative alchemy. Whether it's a Hindu goddess shattering chains or a Buddhist monk radiating metta in captivity, the underlying message transcends doctrine. Suffering need not be the end of the story. And just as these tales reshape memory, they reshape physical space. The next chapter in this journey takes us from legend to limestone, exploring how architecture itself becomes a canvas for redemption, where vaulted ceilings replace iron ceilings and every arch whispers of transformation. Consider the weight of a single stone cut by hands long gone, stacked to form a wall meant to isolate and intimidate. Now imagine that same stone, centuries later, cradling the flicker of votive candles, its surface smoothed by generations of reverent touches. This is the architectural metamorphosis of sacred prisons, where physical spaces don't just change purpose, they're reborn, their very bones reshaped by devotion. Take Sicily's Carcere dello Steri, a 14th century Inquisition prison where prisoners once scratched desperate prayers into the plaster. Today, those same walls are studded with contemporary art installations, light projections that trace the outlines of long-vanished graffiti, turning cries of anguish into something luminous. The iron bars remain, but now they frame not captives, but delicate glass reliquaries holding fragments of rosaries left behind. It's a stunning visual paradox, the architecture of control repurposed as a canvas for remembrance. Light plays a starring role in these transformations. In the carcere's underground cells, where sunlight never reached, skylights were punched through centuries later, flooding the space with shafts of illumination that seem almost theatrical in their symbolism. Similarly, Rome's Mamertine prison, once accessible only through a hole in the ceiling, a design meant to emphasize helplessness, now features a staircase for pilgrims, turning the descent into a deliberate, ceremonial act. Even the acoustics shift. Where echoes of clanking chains once dominated, the space now resonates with murmured prayers or the ethereal notes of choirs performing where torture once occurred. These aren't just practical renovations, they're sensory rebranding, using light, sound, and texture to overwrite a site's emotional legacy. Then there's the power of adornment. Frescoes of saints now cover walls where prisoners once counted cracks in the stone. In Istanbul's Anemas dungeons, Byzantine-era brickwork is punctuated by Ottoman-era prayer niches carved directly into the mortar, layering faith upon faith. At the Tower of London, the Beauchamp Tower's grim inscriptions etched by Tudor prisoners are highlighted with gentle spotlights, their anguish curated into an exhibit on resilience. The most striking example might be Palermo's Oratorio di San Lorenzo, where Caravaggio's Nativity once hung above a former prison chapel, its depiction of Christ's vulnerability mirroring the suffering once endured below. When the painting was stolen in 1969, the empty space became its own kind of relic, a reminder that sanctification isn't about erasing history but framing it. Relics themselves are the ultimate architectural alchemists. A shackle displayed on velvet in a glass case isn't just an object, it's a narrative pivot. In Rome's Basilica di San Pietro in Vincoli, the chains said to have bound Saint Peter are enshrined in a golden reliquary, their brutal function negated by their presentation as sacred proof of divine intervention. Similarly, the Blasciani Palace's torture devices, now arranged in cross-shaped patterns behind altars, become not tools of pain but symbols of transcendence. Tourists don't flinch from these artifacts. They photograph them, touch their display cases, as if proximity might transmit some of the grace that redeemed them. This leads to an unexpected irony. The very features designed to dehumanize, thick walls, narrow windows, oppressive silence, now amplify the contemplative atmosphere visitors seek. A prison courtyard built to prevent escape becomes the perfect cloister for meditation. A solitary confinement cell's acoustics magnify the impact of a whispered prayer. The architecture of control, stripped of its original intent, reveals an unintended sacred geometry. And perhaps that's the most profound transformation of all. Not just that these places changed, but that their darkest qualities became the very reason they shine. Now the question isn't just how relics sanctify space, but how their presence blurs the line between memory and myth, a tension that pulses at the heart of every holy prison story. Bones hidden beneath prison floors, rusted chains coiled in reliquaries, these fragments of suffering become sacred bridges between the earthly and the divine. When workers renovating Rome's San Paolo alle Tre Fontane in the 16th century uncovered iron fetters buried near an ancient cistern, the discovery sparked immediate fervor. Church authorities declared them the very chains that bound St. Paul during his imprisonment, and suddenly, a forgotten corner of the prison complex became a pilgrimage destination. The relics weren't just displayed, they were enshrined in a crystal case, bathed in candlelight, their rough iron transformed into a gleaming testament to faith's triumph over tyranny. This alchemy, turning instruments of restraint into vessels of grace, isn't unique. Across Europe, the unearthing of bones in former dungeons followed a similar script. Anonymous remains attributed to martyrs, their identities shaped less by forensic evidence than by the collective hunger for holiness. Rituals grew around these relics, blending tactile memory with devotion. At the Mamatine, pilgrims once pressed coins into the prison's walls, leaving behind metallic imprints like whispered prayers. In Sicily's carcery dell'Osteri, visitors still trace their fingers over grooves where prisoners etched crosses, as if touch could transmit some echo of their resilience. These acts aren't merely symbolic, they're physical dialogues with the past, a way to close the gap between centuries through shared sensation. The chains of St. Paul, for instance, are paraded through Rome every year on his feast day, their clinking echoing through streets once patrolled by the soldiers who imprisoned him. The sound, once a noise of terror, now signals celebration, a sonic reclaiming of history. Yet the reverence for these objects often overshadows their grim origins. The shackles venerated in Toledo's Santa Cruz Museum were likely mass-produced for countless prisoners, their individuality erased until one set was anointed as holy. This selective sanctification reveals a fascinating tension. We honor the artifact not for what it is, but for the story we've draped over it, the bones beneath Prague's scent. George's Basilica, once thought to belong to martyred nobles, were later proven to be common criminals, but the myth outlasted the facts because the narrative of righteousness enduring persecution mattered more than forensic truth. Folklore sometimes rewrote history entirely. In Avignon, the Tour de la Gâche, a medieval debtor's prison, was rebranded as the Tower of Miracles after locals spun tales of a starving prisoner fed by angels. The tower's crumbling walls became a site of vigil, its true purpose eclipsed by a story no one could prove, but no one wanted to disprove. This isn't deception. It's the human instinct to forge meaning from chaos, to insist that even in the darkest cells, the divine was present. And that's where our journey takes its most surprising turn, to sites where not just objects, but entire prison histories were reinvented, their pasts reshaped by stories too powerful to resist. Some of the most famous prison-turned shrines aren't just layered with myth, they're entirely remade by it, their true histories swallowed by stories too vivid to question. Take London's Bloody Tower, where visitors today hear chilling accounts of two young princes murdered by their usurping uncle, Richard III. The problem: there's no concrete evidence the boys died there at all. The tower's grim nickname and reputation as a royal killing ground only took hold centuries later, when Tudor propagandists needed a convenient villain to legitimize their rule. Over time, the fictionalized account immortalized by Shakespeare became so entrenched that the actual medieval prison's mundane administrative functions faded from memory. What was once a records office and royal mint is now forever stained by imaginary blood, its bricks mythologized as silent witnesses to a crime that may never have happened within its walls. This historical amnesia isn't accidental, it serves a purpose. Nations often reshape prison narratives to forge collective identity. In Malta, the dark, twisting passages of the Castellania were once a feared courthouse prison under the Knights Hospitaller. But when British colonial rulers took over, they rebranded the site as the Chamber of Justice, emphasizing order over oppression. By the 20th century, Maltese guides spun tales of a secret tunnel where unjustly accused prisoners escaped with angelic help, a story that mirrored the island's own struggle for independence. The real prison, it became a footnote to a legend that better served the people's need for a triumphant underdog narrative. Tourism accelerates these reinventions. Edinburgh's Tolbooth prison, demolished in the 19th century, was resurrected as a haunted attraction based entirely on Sir Walter Scott's fictionalized accounts. Visitors now pay to see a dungeon that never existed as described, complete with wax figures of made-up prisoners. The economic incentive is clear. Trauma repackaged as entertainment sells better than bureaucratic truth. Even UNESCO listings play a role when Albania nominated the remains of Spak prison, a brutal communist-era gulag. Officials downplayed its 20th century horrors to highlight older Ottoman-era religious graffiti, reframing the site as a timeless symbol of interfaith endurance rather than a specific place of modern suffering. But is this storytelling harmless? For descendants of those imprisoned in places like Spak, the erasure of recent pain for a palatable myth can feel like betrayal. Conversely, communities devastated by oppression sometimes embrace invented pasts as survival mechanisms. In Portugal's Aljube prison, now a resistance museum, original fascist-era cells were reconstructed not with factual austerity, but with symbolic murals of doves and broken chains, a deliberate choice to focus visitors on hope rather than horror. The line between healing and deception blurs when legends become literal. Modern societies now grapple consciously with this tension. At Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, tours explicitly contrast the prison's factual history with the paranormal myths popularized by TV ghost hunters. In South Africa, Robben Island's guides, many former political prisoners refuse to let Mandela's legacy overshadow other inmate stories, insisting the truth, however messy, must anchor the site's meaning. These approaches acknowledge something profound, that sacred spaces born from suffering owe their power not to fairy tales, but to the raw humanity they preserve. The stones remember even when the stories forget, and that brings us to our final reflection, not on how myths transform prisons, but on why we keep returning to these sites, seeking answers in their shadows. The transformation of prisons into sacred sites isn't confined to ancient history. It's happening right now in our own era, with narratives still being written in real time. Take Alcatraz, America's most infamous island prison, where the cold waters of San Francisco Bay once made escape seem impossible. For decades, it was synonymous with hardened criminals like Al Capone. But in 1969, a group of Native American activists occupied the island for 19 months, draping the abandoned cell blocks with banners declaring "Red Power." Their protest demanding the return of ancestral lands didn't just change Alcatraz's story, it rewrote it entirely. Suddenly, the prison wasn't just a relic of crime and punishment. It became a stage for indigenous resistance, its crumbling walls echoing with drums and ceremonial chants. Visitors today don't just hear about Al Capone's solitary confinement, they learn how the occupation turned steel bars into symbols of sovereignty, proving that even in the 20th century, myth-making could reclaim spaces of oppression. Half a world away, South Africa's Robben Island underwent an even more profound metamorphosis. For centuries, it housed political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, who spent 18 years breaking limestone in its quarries under apartheid's brutal rule. Yet after apartheid fell, the island didn't become a monument to suffering alone, it became a classroom. Former prisoners returned as tour guides, their first-hand accounts transforming each grim corridor into a lesson in resilience. Unlike ancient sites where legends grew organically over centuries, Robben Island's narrative was consciously crafted, its truth meticulously preserved. The prison's most powerful artifact, Mandela's tiny cell, left deliberately unadorned. No angels or miracles adorn its walls, just the stark reality of a space where humanity triumphed without mythologizing the hardship. This raises a fascinating contrast between past and present. Ancient prisons became sacred through layers of folklore that often blurred fact and fiction, but modern sites like Robben Island grapple consciously with historical accuracy. At the former Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, exhibits don't speak of divine intervention, they display prisoners' actual letters and SS duty rosters, letting unvarnished truth carry the moral weight. Yet even here, subtle myth-making occurs. The topography of Terror Museum's garden, planted over rubble where interrogations happened, is now a place of quiet reflection, its greenery softening the edges of memory. Could today's prisons become tomorrow's shrines? Consider how activists already memorialize sites like Guantanamo Bay, leaving flowers at its gates as if honoring martyrs. Or how Australia's Port Arthur, once a penal colony, now hosts ghost tours that blend historical trauma with supernatural lore. The economic force behind these transformations is undeniable. Sacred tourism generates millions, from the gift shops outside Rome's Mamertine prison to the ferry tickets to Alcatraz. But this commercialization isn't necessarily cynical. It's often what preserves these sites, funding their transition from places of pain to places of meaning. The difference lies in who controls the narrative. Where medieval peasants ascribed miracles to dungeon walls, modern communities, especially marginalized ones, increasingly demand the right to tell their own stories. The result is a new kind of sacred space, one where chains aren't gilded with legend but displayed as evidence. Yet the human impulse remains the same, to walk these corridors and leave not just remembering the darkness, but carrying away sparks of something brighter. Walk through the gift shop of Rome's Mamatine prison today, and you'll find replicas of St. Peter's chains cast in gleaming silver, miniature dungeon bricks labeled Holy Stone, even bottles of miracle spring water from the legend of his baptismal font. These souvenirs might seem jarring against the backdrop of ancient suffering, but they reveal an undeniable truth. Sacred prisons don't just survive on faith alone, they thrive on the economy of belief. Every candle purchased, every guided tour ticket sold, every coin dropped into donation boxes bolted to former execution chambers feeds the delicate ecosystem that keeps these sites alive. The irony is palpable. Spaces once designed to isolate now depend on crowds, their spiritual resonance measured in visitor numbers and revenue streams. Jerusalem's Prison of Christ offers a stark case study in this balancing act. Tucked beneath a bustling street near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the dim, cave-like cell where Jesus is said to have awaited crucifixion sits mere steps from neon-lit cafes selling espresso and falafel wraps. Pilgrims queue for hours to touch the stone where his chains supposedly rested, while outside, vendors hawk olive wood crosses and authentic crown of thorns replicas. Critics argue this commercial swirl cheapens the sacred, turning profound history into a spiritual theme park. Yet without these dollars and euros, many sites would crumble into oblivion. The upkeep of ancient architecture reinforcing crumbling dungeon walls, preserving fragile frescoes costs far more than entrance fees alone can cover. That tension between preservation and profiteering isn't easily resolved. For local communities, these transformations often bring unexpected windfalls. In Gwalior, India, the temple that grew from a Mughal prison's legend now supports entire families through tourism guides, artisans carving devotional statues, even street food vendors catering to pilgrims. Lyon's Basilica of St. Irenaeus, built over Roman dungeons, funds social programs with donations left at the Martyrs' crypt. The myths retold within these walls don't just shape identity, they create livelihoods, turning grim history into economic opportunity. But beneath the glow of votive candles and ringing cash registers, darker questions linger. When a prison's brutality is repackaged as a sacred attraction whose suffering gets commodified. At Istanbul's Anemas dungeons, the audio guide narrates tales of angelic visitations while glossing over Byzantine torture techniques. In Rome, few plaques mention the enslaved people who died in the Mamertine before Peter's arrival, their stories eclipsed by the more marketable miracle. This selective memory raises ethical dilemmas. Is it reverence or erasure when only the redemptive chapters of a site's past are highlighted? The answer often depends on who controls the narrative. At Robben Island, former prisoners now lead tours, ensuring profits fund educational initiatives rather than corporate pockets. Contrast that with private-owned, haunted prison attractions that sensationalize pain without honoring its real victims. The line between memorial and monetization blurs when sacred sites become stopovers on Instagram itineraries, their spiritual weight reduced to a photo op between lunch and souvenir shopping. Yet perhaps this very tension between the sacred and the soul reveals something raw about human nature. We don't just want to remember these places, we want to take home a piece of their transformed meaning, whether it's a vial of dirt from a saint's cell or a selfie where suffering once reigned. The souvenirs, the crowds, even the cafes encroaching on holy ground, they're all part of the messy, contradictory way we keep these stories alive. But as the next chapter reveals, not every prison's darkness can be gilded by myth. Some histories resist redemption, their stones stubbornly refusing to soften. Not every prison's transformation into sacred ground goes unchallenged. Beneath the glow of votive candles and the murmur of prayers, there are voices that resist the smoothing over of history, voices that insist some wounds shouldn't be gilded with myth. Take Argentina's ESMA, a former naval mechanics school turned clandestine detention center during the Dirty War, where thousands were tortured and disappeared. When the government proposed rebranding it as a memory park, families of victims protested. To them, covering the building's bullet scars with murals or hosting concerts in its courtyard wasn't redemption, it was erasure. This isn't a place for angels, one survivor's daughter argued. The walls didn't whisper comfort, they absorbed screams. Her words cut to the heart of a fraught debate. When does retelling become rewriting? The tension is especially raw where political trauma is recent. At Vilnius's KGB Museum, preserved Soviet prison cells display graffiti left by executed dissidents, names scratched into walls alongside final prayers. But when local artists proposed installing hopeful light installations, survivors' groups balked. "You don't put stained glass in a mass grave," objected a historian whose father died there. Similar clashes erupt in Cambodia's Chuol Sleng, a former school-turned-Khmer Rouge torture center. While some visitors leave offerings for victims, others bristle at the suggestion that spiritual reverence should soften the building's purpose, to bear witness to unvarnished horror. Archaeology often sharpens these debates. Ground-penetrating radar at Spain's Carabanchel prison, where political prisoners languished under Franco, revealed hidden tunnels dug by inmates. Preservationists wanted to highlight them as symbols of resistance, but descendants demanded the tunnels remain undisturbed. "Digging them up feels like exploitation," argued a woman whose grandfather died there. Their struggle wasn't a spectacle. Even at sites with ancient martyrs, science complicates law. Carbon dating of the chains of St. Peter in Rome showed they likely originated centuries after his death, yet the faithful still queue to touch them. Belief and evidence don't always reconcile neatly. Perhaps the sharpest challenge to sanctified prisons comes from those who see myth-making as displacement, not healing. In Ireland's Kilmainham jail, where leaders of the Easter Rising were executed, nationalist ballads turned rebels into saints, but newer exhibits emphasize the prison's earlier role in incarcerating impoverished children during the famine. The stones remember more than one story, a curator noted. "We can't let one glorious narrative silence the others." This layered approach, holding space for both pain and transcendence, might offer a way forward. After all, the same walls can echo with screams and hymns, if we're willing to listen for both. Now, emerging technologies are revealing even deeper complexities beneath these contested sites, where every scan and excavation uncovers new layers of truth and tale. But that's a discovery waiting in the next chapter. Beneath the stone floors of Jerusalem's Church of St. Peter in Galicantu, built over what tradition calls the House of Caiaphas, where Jesus was held before trial, archaeologists unearthed something unexpected. A network of ancient cisterns and storage rooms, but no clear evidence of a high priest's residence. The discovery sent ripples through the faithful who'd knelt for centuries at the site believed to be the very dungeon where Peter denied Christ. Yet rather than shattering belief, the findings sparked a different kind of reckoning. Pilgrims still flock there, but now the narrative has expanded. The cisterns, once mundane, are framed as part of a broader sacred landscape, their rough walls reinterpreted as witnesses to a larger spiritual drama. This tension between trowel and testament reveals how sacred sites evolve not just through faith or fact, but in the restless space between them. Take the case of Rome's Mamertine prison again. For generations, guides pointed to a worn stone near the entrance, claiming it bore the imprint of St. Peter's head where he struck it during a miraculous baptism. Then archaeologists noted the stone's composition didn't match the prison's original masonry. It was a later addition. Did the revelation empty the site of meaning? Not for the pilgrims who still pressed their foreheads to that spot. The stone's inauthenticity mattered less than the truth it carried, that someone, centuries ago, cared enough about the story to embed it physically in the prison's fabric. Archaeology here doesn't debunk, it adds strata to the myth, showing how each generation leaves its own fingerprints on the past. Sometimes, though, excavations unveil truths too stark to spiritualize. Beneath Prague's Church of St. George, researchers uncovered mass graves filled with skeletons showing signs of torture victims of 10th century political purges. Local law had long claimed these were the remains of martyred nobles who defended Christianity. The bones told a messier story. Some belonged to teenagers, others to common thieves. Yet, rather than dismiss the site, the church displayed the findings alongside the legends, creating a dialogue between devotion and evidence. The martyr's shrine didn't vanish. it expanded to hold both the idealized narrative and the complicated humanity beneath it. Graffiti offers some of the most poignant intersections of fact and faith. In Sicily's carcere dello Steri, ultraviolet scans revealed hundreds of inscriptions hidden beneath layers of plaster prayers scratched by Inquisition prisoners in their own blood. Among them, a single phrase stood out: "Non sono eretico," I am not a heretic. The words, once cries of desperation, are now encircled in gold leaf, their author venerated as a saint by locals despite no formal canonization. Here, archaeology didn't challenge the sacred. It gave voice to the silenced, turning anonymous suffering into individualized reverence. The psychology behind these transformations is as layered as the sites themselves. When a 12th century inscription in Avignon's Tower of the Hungry confirmed prisoners really were starved there, contradicting the Tower of Miracles legend, the community didn't abandon the story. They grafted it onto the new facts. Yes, people starved, one guide explained, but doesn't that make the tale of angels feeding a prisoner even more miraculous? This isn't denial, it's a deeply human insistence that even in the face of incontrovertible evidence, meaning can be mined from the darkness. We don't just want history, we want history redeemed. Perhaps that's why the most contested sites are those where pain is too fresh for myth to soften. At Spain's Carabanchel prison, forensic teams cataloging execution bullet holes clashed with activists who wanted the walls whitewashed for art projects. "You can't paint over ghosts," argued a survivor. Yet even here, a compromise emerged. The bullet marks were preserved, but beside them, families planted a garden where rosemary, an herb of remembrance, grows in cracks between the paving stones. The lesson echoes across these spaces. Archaeology may expose the bones of the past, but it's the living who decide whether to curse or consecrate them. And so the dance continues, spades uncovering one truth, hearts weaving another, neither fully erasing the other. The next chapter in this story doesn't lie buried in stone, but in the hands of those who hold the keys to these sites today, balancing preservation with the ever-shifting weight of memory. The impulse to rewrite the stories of places marked by suffering isn't just cultural, it's wired into our psychology. Cognitive dissonance theory offers one lens. When faced with the unbearable reality of what happened in these prisons, we reshape the narrative to resolve the tension between pain and meaning. Dr. Elena Voss, a historian of collective memory, puts it this way: myths don't erase trauma, they domesticate it. A dungeon where saints triumphed over tormentors is easier to live with than one where cruelty went unanswered. This psychological alchemy transforms helplessness into agency, randomness into divine plan. But redemption isn't the only way societies cope. Cambodia's Chuol Sleng, preserved exactly as the Khmer Rouge left it, bloodstains on the floors, photographs of victims staring from the walls, serves as a stark counterpoint. Here, the refusal to soften history is itself a form of healing, a communal vow: never again. The contrast raises a profound question: is the drive to sanctify suffering universal or culturally dictated? Anthropologist Miguel de Lara's work with indigenous communities in South America suggests both. In Quechua traditions, sites of colonial torture were often ritually cleansed and repurposed as shrines to earth deities, blending pre-Christian and Catholic symbolism. Yet in post-war Germany, some concentration camps remain frozen in time, their barracks left standing not as temples but as tombstones. The difference may lie in what a culture needs most: closure or warning, transcendence or remembrance. Artists grappling with these spaces often amplify the tension. At Alcatraz, A.I. Weiwei's installation at large filled empty cells with Lego portraits of political prisoners worldwide, merging playfulness with protest. In Chile's Villa Grimaldi, a former torture center turned peace park, sound artist Sebastián Jatz created a haunting audio walk where whispers of poetry drift through rose gardens planted over interrogation rooms. These interventions don't redeem the horror, they hold it up to the light, letting viewers decide whether transformation is possible or even desirable. Perhaps the most telling insight comes from survivors themselves. At a symposium on sacred prisons, former Robben Island inmate Tando Mbeki observed, "When tourists ask if I've forgiven my jailers, they want a story of chains turned to garlands." But real healing isn't about rewriting, it's about carrying the weight without being crushed. His words linger in the air, a reminder that while myths may comfort the living, the stones remember everything. Across the walls of the Carcere dello Steri in Sicily, a fresco from the 16th century shows Saint Anthony preaching to fish, an odd choice for a former Inquisition prison, until you notice the chains coiled at his feet, rusted but broken. This is how art begins its work, not by erasing the darkness of these spaces, but by threading light through it. Creative reinterpretations of sanctified prisons, from medieval paintings to modern films, don't just reflect myths, they shape them, turning whispers of the past into shouts that echo across centuries. Consider the paradox of Caravaggio's Flagellation of Christ, painted for Naples' San Domenico Maggiore, built over an Angevin dungeon. The artist's signature chiaroscuro doesn't soften the violence, it heightens it, the ropes cutting deep into Christ's flesh as light pools around his serene face. Yet pilgrims who viewed it kneeling on the prison's repurposed stones didn't see torture alone, they saw triumph preordained. Art here acts as a prism, refracting suffering into something bearable, even beautiful. The same tension pulses through the Passion of the Christ, filmed partly at Matara's ancient cave prisons. Director Mel Gibson didn't just use the location for authenticity. He leaned into its layered history, letting the stones, once soaked with the sweat of forgotten prisoners, become silent co-stars in the Passion's drama. But art doesn't always sanctify. In Greece, the raw, twangy notes of rebetiko, folk songs born in Ottoman-era prisons, refused to romanticize captivity. The Black Handkerchief, a ballad from the Avarov prison, croons of a prisoner's longing for the sea, his chains clinking like a macabre percussion. These songs, passed down by ex-convicts, preserve a counter-narrative. No angels intervened here, only endurance. Modern artists continue this tradition. Aiway Strait, a river of twisted rebar from Sichuan earthquake ruins laid out in a former Venetian jail, forces viewers to walk alongside devastation, offering no easy redemption. The installation doesn't sanctify the space, it interrogates it, asking who gets to decide when pain becomes meaningful. Authority figures have always wielded art as a tool to steer these stories. Medieval bishops commissioned frescoes of chained saints for prison chapels, subtly equating spiritual liberation with loyalty to the church. Franco's regime turned Toledo's Santa Cruz prison into a patriotic museum, plastering over inmates' graffiti with heroic murals of Spanish conquests. Yet subversion persists. In Chile's Villa Grimaldi, now a peace park, artist Alfredo Jar installed 1,000 light bulbs in the former torture cells, each pulsing to the rhythm of a survivor's heartbeat. The work doesn't erase the site's horror, it insists on life stubbornly persisting within it. This dance between control and creativity reveals the true power of art in sanctified prisons. It doesn't just decorate history. It argues with it, offering new ways to see the same stones not as monuments to what was done, but as canvases for what might yet be. And that leads us to the architects of these narratives, the authorities and institutions that decide whose stories get gilded and whose remain in shadow. Who gets to decide when a prison's darkness becomes divine? The answer often lies in the tug of war between institutions and individuals, between popes proclaiming miracles from marble balconies and villagers lighting candles in secret. Take the Vatican's meticulous process for certifying prison miracles. When chains allegedly shattered in the Mamertine, it wasn't enough for locals to whisper of St. Peter's power. Church investigators scrutinized witnesses, demanded physical proof, and only after years of deliberation declared the event worthy of veneration. This formal stamp didn't just validate belief, it centralized control, ensuring Rome, not some rogue preacher, held the keys to the narrative. Contrast that with grassroots movements like Sicily's Carceri dello Steri, where prisoners' graffiti evolved into unofficial shrines long before the church acknowledged them. Fishermen's wives began sneaking in to pray at the scratched crosses left by condemned heretics, their whispered devotions growing into a full-blown cult. By the time bishops reluctantly sanctioned the site, its holiness was already woven into local identity, proof that sacredness can bubble up from below before trickling down from above. Political powers play an equally forceful role. After the French Revolution, Paris's conciergerie, where Marie Antoinette awaited execution, was hastily rebranded as a temple of republican justice. State pamphlets spun the Queen's suffering as symbolic of tyranny's fall, her cell curated into a patriotic exhibit. Yet within decades, royalists quietly draped her former prison in black velvet and lilies, reclaiming it as a shrine to martyrdom. The space didn't change, the storytellers did, each regime weaponizing its walls to legitimize their authority. The survival of these stories hinges on who holds the megaphone. Consider the suppression of female mystics' prison visions in medieval Spain, where the Inquisition dismissed their ecstasies as hysteria, unless they conveniently supported church doctrine. Meanwhile, male saints' jailhouse miracles were meticulously recorded, their chains enshrined in gold. This curation of narratives reveals an uncomfortable truth: sanctification isn't just about faith. It's about who has the power to say which suffering counts, which brings us to an often overlooked thread in this tapestry: how gender shapes the myths that cling to these stones. Because when the prisoners weren't apostles or kings, but women, their stories had to fight twice as hard to be heard. The stories we tell about imprisoned saints and mystics are never gender neutral. They carry the fingerprints of the societies that shaped them. Consider the stark contrast between how male and female prisoners are remembered. Male figures like St. Paul or the Lyon martyrs are often portrayed as unbreakable warriors of faith, their suffering framed as a physical battle against tyranny. Their miracles tend to involve defiance, chains shattering, jailers converting, voices booming through stone walls. But women like Perpetua and Felicity, imprisoned in Carthage's dungeons for their Christian faith, are depicted differently. Their legends emphasize visions, intimate dialogues with God, and ethereal transcendence over bodily pain. Where male prisoners wrestle their captors, female prisoners seem to float above them, their holiness measured in whispers and luminous apparitions rather than raw endurance. This divide isn't accidental. Medieval hagiographers, almost exclusively male, often framed women's prison experiences through the lens of mystical union, a socially acceptable way to sanctify female suffering without threatening patriarchal authority. Perpetua's diary, one of the few surviving first-person accounts from an ancient prisoner, reveals her vivid dreams of climbing a ladder to heaven while her male companions grapple with dragons below. The imagery is telling. Her salvation is vertical, inward, while theirs is horizontal, a struggle against earthly foes. Even their deaths reflect this dichotomy. Male martyrs are frequently shown enduring brutal public executions, broken on wheels, devoured by lions, while women like Felicity are described as almost serene in their final moments, their pain softened by divine embrace. Yet there are striking exceptions that expose the fragility of these tropes. Joan of Arc's prison cell in Rouen, France, defies the mystic template. Her story wasn't one of passive visions but of battlefield prowess and political audacity. Accordingly, her cell became a site of militaristic veneration. Napoleon later displayed her alleged shackles as symbols of national resilience, not piety. Similarly, the Turkish Sufi mystic Rabia al-Adawiyya, imprisoned for her unorthodox teachings, was celebrated not for ethereal visions but for verbally sparring with her jailers, her wit as sharp as any male martyr's. These outliers hint at what might have been if more women's stories had escaped the soft cage of hagiography. The gendering of prison myths even extends to the relics left behind. Male saints' chains are displayed as battle trophies, their weight and roughness emphasized, but the few artifacts tied to female prisoners, like the veil said to have caught Saint Agnes' tears in Rome's Mamertine, are delicate, almost fragile. This curation isn't just about the objects themselves, it's about the narratives they uphold. A heavy chain proves strength, a tear-stained veil proves tenderness. Perhaps most revealing is how these gendered scripts persist in modern interpretations. When archaeologists uncovered the bones of women in the Lyon crypts, their fractures identical to the male martyrs, some scholars still insisted their suffering must have been more spiritual than physical. The stones tell one story, the myths another, and just as human hands shape these tales, so too does the natural world. Water, light, even the very air of these prisons becomes part of the sacred narrative. But that's a transformation where gender gives way to something more elemental. Water gushing from barren stone, beams of sunlight piercing dungeon gloom. These aren't just miracles, they're nature rewriting the script of confinement. When a spring reportedly burst forth in St. Peter's cell in Rome's Mamatine prison, it didn't just quench thirst, it transformed the space's very identity. Water, symbolizing purification and rebirth in nearly every spiritual tradition, turned a place designed to dehydrate hope into a wellspring of divine intervention. Similar legends echo globally. In Morocco's Tazadout, a desert prison's cracked floor allegedly sprouted a freshwater stream after a Sufi mystic prayed, while Japanese folklore tells of a Zen monk whose execution site became a healing hot spring. These stories share a pattern: nature intervening where humanity failed, offering not just physical relief but cosmic reassurance that no space is beyond redemption. Light plays an equally transformative role. Consider Saint Barbara, locked in a tower by her pagan father, only for lightning to shatter its walls, a celestial rebuke that turned her prison into a symbol of faith's invincibility. The motif repeats in Ethiopia's Deba Domo monastery, where tradition says a serpent's glowing scales illuminated the cliffside prison of Abba Aragowi, guiding monks to his cell. Even without supernatural claims, the interplay of light and architecture alters sacred spaces. The oculus in Rome's Pantheon, originally a military structure, pours sunlight onto the floor like liquid gold, repurposing imperial might as divine radiance. In these tales, light isn't just illumination, it's revelation, exposing the hidden holiness in engineered darkness. These phenomena aren't random, they tap into deep archetypes. Springs represent the underworld's generosity, a theme from Greek myths of Persephone to Mayan cenotes believed to gateways to the gods. Divine light mirrors the universal hero's journey, where darkness precedes enlightenment. By grafting such symbols onto prisons, cultures perform a kind of spiritual alchemy. The stones remain, but their meaning is transfigured. The Mamatine spring didn't erase its history of executions. It reframed them as preludes to baptism, the water erasing not the past but its finality. Yet time itself is the most potent alchemist. The same cracks medieval prisoners saw as signs of decay, modern pilgrims venerate as proof of divine intervention, nature's slow reclamation repurposed as sacred text. In Turkey's Zindan Gate, ivy creeping through iron bars was reinterpreted as a saint's lingering presence, while seismic shifts that tilted a Mexican prison's walls became the hand of God correcting human injustice. Even erosion, the patient sculptor of landscapes, gets drafted into these narratives, its gradual work spun as celestial craftsmanship. The result is a sacred geography where geology and grace intertwine. When visitors to Malta's St. Paul's Grotto touch walls glistening with mineral deposits, they're not just touching rock, they're touching a story where nature conspired with the divine to turn a cave into a chapel. These sites challenge the divide between built and born, suggesting holiness isn't constructed, but recognized waiting in the water, the light, the very air for stories to set it free. Time doesn't just pass, it transforms, especially when it comes to the stories we tell about sacred prisons. Take the letters of St. Paul, penned in Roman captivity. His original words, preserved in the New Testament, describe hardship with startling restraint. I bear on my body the marks of Christ. No angels breaking chains, no earthquakes splitting walls, just quiet endurance. Yet fast forward a few centuries, and medieval manuscripts paint a very different picture. Suddenly, Paul's imprisonment brims with miracles. Guards struck blind, his shackles melting like wax, even a talking lion in his cell borrowed from Daniel's legend. This isn't careless exaggeration, it's the alchemy of oral tradition, where each retelling adds another layer of gold leaf to the story until the humble original gleams like a reliquary. The process unfolds in stages. Early church fathers like Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, first hinted at supernatural interventions, Paul converting his jailer through debate or surviving a poisoned cup. By the 5th century, Syrian hymns describe his chains glowing with celestial light. By the Middle Ages, stained glass windows at Chartres Cathedral show him preaching to a crowd of enchanted prison rats. Each generation's needs shape the tale. The persecuted church of the 3rd century craved stories of divine vindication, while medieval monasteries emphasized wonder to attract pilgrims. The facts didn't change, but their meaning expanded, like cracks in dungeon walls letting in unexpected light. Written records and oral traditions diverge sharply here. While official church documents kept relatively sober accounts, folk piety ran wild. Travelers' diaries from the 9th century mention local guides at the Mamatine prison showing visitors Paul's finger marks scorched into the stone by holy fire, a detail absent from any papal record. Ballads sung in Provençal taverns turned Paul's jailer into a reformed brigand who later became a bishop. These weren't lies, they were living theology, a way for ordinary people to claim the story as their own. Modern media accelerates this evolution. A 19th century lithograph of Paul's imprisonment might show a single angel. A viral TikTok animation today depicts the apostle blasting through walls like a superhero, his chains becoming particle effects. Virtual reality recreations of biblical prisons let users experience miracles firsthand, shaking floors, digital doves bursting from stone. Podcasts frame Paul's story through self-help lenses, his endurance repackaged as 10 steps to unlock your inner resilience. The core remains, but the trappings morph to fit new appetites for immersion and relevance. Yet beneath the embellishments, something vital persists, the human longing to see suffering redeemed. Whether it's a 3rd century fresco or a YouTube documentary, the impulse is the same: to look at those ancient stones and whisper, "Tell me it wasn't for nothing." That's why these stories endure, not despite their changes, but because of them. They're not history frozen in amber, they're rivers carving new channels through time. But not everyone drinks from these waters unquestioningly. For every believer tracing Paul's footsteps, there's a scholar pointing out the prison's sewer system made miraculous springs unlikely, or a tour guide noting the authentic chains on display were forged centuries later. This tension between faith and fact, devotion and doubt doesn't weaken the stories. It keeps them alive, ensuring they're not just repeated, but wrestled with, each generation adding its own scars to the prison walls. History and faith don't always walk hand in hand, especially when it comes to sacred prisons. Take Rome's Mamertine, where tradition insists St. Peter was held before his martyrdom. Archaeologists point out a glaring problem. The prison's construction dates to centuries after Peter's death, carbon testing on the venerated chains. Likely medieval, not apostolic, yet every day pilgrims still kneel in that damp chamber, pressing their lips to stone scholars say Peter never touched. This isn't ignorance, it's a deliberate choice to privilege spiritual truth over historical fact. As one priest leading a tour group put it, does it matter if the walls are 1st century or 5th? What matters is what happens when someone prays here now. The tension plays out even more vividly at Padua's so-called prison of St. Anthony. Local law claims the beloved Franciscan mystic was confined in its windowless cell, where he reportedly levitated during prayer. But university researchers uncovered records showing the building served as a grain warehouse until decades after Anthony's death. The church's solution. A carefully worded plaque. Tradition holds that St. Anthony was imprisoned in this area. Guides deftly navigate the ambiguity, acknowledging academic doubts while emphasizing the site's power as a focal point for devotion. Visitors leave with both perspectives, the skeptic's raised eyebrow and the believer's quiet awe. Some communities push back harder against scholarly skepticism. In Malta, when historians questioned whether St. Paul really shipwrecked on the island, let alone preached from a grotto-turned prison, locals responded by doubling down on annual festivities. The Emnaja festival now features reenactments of Paul baptizing his jailer, complete with artificial chains that gleam under stage lights. The message is clear: some stories are too precious to be dismantled by parchment and carbon dating. Yet not all believers reject historical scrutiny. At Lyon's Crypt of the Martyrs, recent DNA analysis of bones confirmed they belonged to 2nd century victims, but couldn't prove they were the venerated Christians. Instead of hiding the findings, the Archdiocese incorporated them into exhibits, inviting visitors to ponder the difference between provable facts and enduring legacy. One display asks pointedly, does it diminish their sacrifice if we don't know their names? For modern visitors, these contradictions often become part of the pilgrimage experience. At Istanbul's Anemas dungeons, tourist reviews swing wildly. Some call it a sacred encounter, others a well-preserved scam. Yet even skeptics admit feeling something uncanny in those shadowed corridors. A British traveler's journal captures the paradox. I know these angel sightings are medieval PR, but when the light slants just right through the arrow slits, I get why people believed. Perhaps that's the real alchemy of these places. They don't resolve the tension between fact and faith. They thrive on it, leaving each visitor to decide where history ends and holiness begins. And that decision often hinges on something deeper than evidence, on the stories we cling to when the night is darkest, and the stones, regardless of their age, still hold our whispered prayers. Walk through the dim corridors of Rome's Mamatine prison today, and you'll hear a symphony of reactions, gasps of reverence, murmurs of doubt, even occasional scoffing laughter. One pilgrim from Mexico City presses her palm to the damp stone, tears streaming as she whispers a prayer to St. Peter. A few feet away, a German scholar checks his guidebook against the Latin inscriptions, muttering about medieval embellishments. Online reviews capture this clash of emotions in stark relief. "Felt the Holy Spirit like electricity in my bones," writes a Pentecostal preacher from Texas. A textbook case of myth masquerading as history counters a Cambridge archaeology student. These aren't just differing opinions, they're windows into how sacred prisons become mirrors, reflecting back what each visitor brings to them. Diaries from 19th century travelers reveal this tension isn't new. British novelist Charles Dickens, touring the Mamertine in 1845, ridiculed the shabby charlatanism of guides claiming to show Peter's exact footprint. Yet his contemporary French mystic Eugénie de Guérin described the same stones as radiant with invisible grace. Fast forward to modern TripAdvisor posts, and the divide persists. A mother from Seoul shares how her child's chronic pain improved after touching the prison's miracle chains, while a history teacher from Toronto posts side-by-side photos proving the displayed shackles are Renaissance-era replicas. The space itself hasn't changed, but the lenses through which we view it fracture into countless prisms of belief and skepticism. Guides and signage often act as mediators in this dance between devotion and doubt. At Istanbul's Anemas dungeons, laminated placards offer two versions of the same event. Tradition holds Emperor Isaac Roman II received heavenly visions here is followed by Byzantine chronicles mention no such occurrence. Some tour companies take this further, offering choose your truth experiences. In Lyon's Crypt of the Martyrs, visitors can select between a faith tour, highlighting miraculous prison breaks, and a fact tour, detailing Roman judicial procedures. This bifurcation isn't just about catering to different audiences, it's a tacit admission that these sites exist in a quantum state, simultaneously factual and mythical until observed through a particular worldview. The emotional spectrum widens when politics enter the picture. At Poland's Wall Castle dungeons, where national hero Tadeusz Kosciuszko was held, Polish visitors often leave flowers and sing independent songs. Meanwhile, Russian tourists sometimes bristle at exhibits framing their imperial ancestors as oppressors, sparking heated guestbook debates. Similar tensions simmer at Spain's Carabanchel prison, where older visitors recall Franco's regime with nostalgia, while younger Spaniards place photos of executed Republicans on the bullet-pocked walls. Here, sacred prisons become battlegrounds over who controls collective memory, the victors, the victims, or the storytellers profiting from both. Yet amid the clashes, moments of unexpected unity emerge. A TripAdvisor photo from Jerusalem's Prison of Christ shows an Israeli archaeologist and a Palestinian grandmother bonding over shared fascination with an ancient graffiti cross. In Malta's St. Paul's Grotto, guest records include joint entries from Muslim and Christian pilgrims who collaborated to decipher Arabic Christian inscriptions left by medieval prisoners. These fleeting connections hint at something profound, that while we may never agree on what happened in these stones, we share an instinct to seek meaning in their shadows. This global patchwork of reactions, awe, ambivalence, anger reveals less about the prisons themselves than about humanity's tangled relationship with history. Whether in Rome or Rwanda, visitors don't just encounter these sites, they complete them, pouring their own hopes, biases, and questions into spaces that would otherwise echo with silence. The next chapter in this story unfolds where preservation meets commerce, as curators wrestle with an impossible question: how to honor both the sanctity and the skepticism these walls provoke. From the misty mountains of Japan to the sun-baked plazas of Mexico, the transformation of prisons into sacred spaces takes on wildly different hues depending on who's telling the story. In Kyoto, the stone cells of Nijo Castle's detention pits where disgraced samurai once awaited execution are now draped with colorful votive plaques. Visitors scribble prayers not for the jailers but for the restless spirits of the warriors, asking their forgiveness and blessing. The twist: many of these samurai were rebels against imperial authority, yet centuries later they're venerated as tragic heroes. It's a distinctly Japanese form of sanctification, where Bushido codes of honor override the crimes that landed them there. Nearby, at Heimji Castle's Suicide Tower, locals leave origami cranes to honor women who leapt to their deaths rather than face capture, turning a site of despair into one of defiant purity. Cross the Pacific to Mexico, and the script flips entirely. Along dusty backroads, tiny chapels glow with neon halos around portraits of Jesus Malverde, the so-called narco saint. Though never officially canonized, this early 20th century bandit executed in a Sinaloa prison is now the patron of those on society's fringes. His shrines often incorporate actual prison artifacts: rusted cell doors repurposed as altars, shivs melted into candle holders. The folklore here doesn't sanitize Malverde's criminal past, it sanctifies his rebellion against inequality. "He robbed the rich and fed the poor" isn't just a tagline, it's theology, turning state punishment into martyrdom. In West Africa, the blend runs deeper still. Ghana's Cape Coast Castle, a hub of the transatlantic slave trade, holds a haunting hybrid of traditions. In the male slave dungeon's darkest corner, visitors find a makeshift shrine where local priests leave offerings of gin and kola nuts alongside Catholic rosaries. The ancestors believed trapped here aren't just remembered, they're actively invoked, their suffering acknowledged as a spiritual debt. Meanwhile, the castle's former chapel, where British colonists once prayed above the groans of the imprisoned, now hosts interfaith ceremonies, its pews facing the sea in remembrance. This isn't simple redemption, it's ritual rebalancing where colonial violence meets indigenous cosmologies of cyclical justice. Even the architectural adaptations reflect cultural priorities. Japan's samurai shrines emphasize purification water basins at every entrance for ritual hand-washing. Mexican chapels prioritize intimacy, with ex voto's tiny votive paintings cramming every inch of wall space, each depicting a personal miracle. West African sites often incorporate circular motifs, echoing traditional symbols of continuity and return. The prison's bones remain, but the flesh of their new identities is shaped by the hands that tend them. What unites these variations is the human insistence that no story is truly finished, not even behind bars. Whether it's a wronged warrior, a rebellious bandit, or an unnamed ancestor, these sites whisper a universal truth: societies sanctify what they need to reconcile. But as digital archives and virtual reality begin reshaping how we engage with history, these physical spaces face an existential question. Can pixels and holograms capture the weight of a chain, the chill of a stone cell, the scent of candle wax layered over centuries of whispered prayers? The answer may determine whether the next chapter of these sites is written in mortar or metadata. Imagine standing in the ruins of an ancient prison, your phone screen flickering as an app superimposes a holographic saint walking the very corridor where you stand, his chains glowing with augmented light. This isn't science fiction, it's the next frontier in how we engage with sacred spaces. As technology reshapes every corner of our lives, it's also rewriting the rules of pilgrimage. Virtual reality headsets now let users step inside the Mamertine prison's legendary darkness, feeling the chill of its stones through haptic feedback gloves. Apps like Sacred Spaces AR overlay animated miracles onto crumbling walls. Tap your screen and watch St. Peter's Spring bubble up from dry earth, or see the Lyon Martyrs graffiti pulse with golden light. These digital layers don't just tell stories, they immerse us in them, blurring the line between physical ruin and mythic reconstruction. But this shift comes with profound questions. When you can don a VR headset and witness St. Paul's chains shattering in cinematic detail, does that deepen faith or dilute it? Scholars at Oxford's Sacred Realities Lab are already studying how augmented mythologies affect visitors' connection to history. Early findings suggest a paradox. While VR makes stories more visceral, it can also flatten their complexity. A medieval pilgrim touching the actual, rusted chains in Rome's San Pietro in Vincoli experienced texture, weight, even the smell of aged iron, all subtle cues that anchored the miracle in tangible reality. Digital recreations, no matter how stunning, risk turning sacred encounters into consumable spectacles, more akin to binge-watching a fantasy series than standing in the presence of the numinous. Yet technology also offers startling opportunities for inclusion. For believers who can't travel to Jerusalem's Prison of Christ, 360-degree virtual tours now provide access to spaces once reserved for the physically mobile. In Malta, stroke survivors use motion-sensitive screens to light digital votive candles at St. Paul's Grotto, their gestures mirrored by real flames in the physical shrine. These innovations aren't just about convenience, they're democratizing devotion, ensuring age or disability don't bar anyone from participation. Even the act of remembrance evolves. At Berlin's Plötzensee Memorial, an AI project collects names of Nazi-era prisoners from fragmented records, projecting their faces onto the execution chamber walls each night, ensuring no victim fades entirely from memory. The most provocative experiments blend the old and new in unexpected ways. In Sicily's Carcere dello Steri, visitors can now scan prisoners' graffiti with an app, triggering oral histories from descendants of the Inquisition's victims. At Portugal's Aljube Museum, augmented reality, ghosts of political prisoners appear when smartphones point at certain cells, reciting poetry they wrote before execution. These hybrids of tech and tradition don't replace materiality, they amplify it, using digital tools to resurrect voices that stone alone couldn't preserve. But the risks are real. When every myth can be rendered in high-definition splendor, will we lose the raw, unvarnished power of these spaces? There's something irreplaceable about standing in the tower of London's Bloody Tower, feeling the uneven grooves where a Tudor prisoner carved a last plea into the stone. No VR headset can fully replicate the weight of that tactile connection. And then there's the danger of distortion. When augmented reality filters let users adjust a prison's appearance to match their preferred era or ideology, history becomes malleable, its hard edges sanded down by algorithmic preferences. Already, some apps offer sanitized tours of Robben Island, omitting apartheid's brutality in favor of uplifting Mandela-focused narratives. Perhaps the answer lies in balance, using technology not to overwrite these spaces, but to deepen our dialogue with them. Imagine a future where scanning a prison wall with your phone doesn't just show a CGI miracle, but layers competing accounts. The official church version, the archaeologist's report, even the skeptical historian's rebuttal. The digital age doesn't have to flatten myth into pixels. It can make it more multidimensional than ever. As we hover on this threshold between the tangible and the virtual, one thing is certain: the human need to sanctify suffering, to find meaning in darkness, hasn't changed. Only the tools have. Whether through candle wax or touchscreen, we're still reaching for the same light, still whispering to the same stones, even if they now whisper back in ones and zeros. The concluding chapter of this journey won't resolve these tensions, but it will ask something far more vital. When the prisons of tomorrow become ruins, what stories will our own hands leave behind? Stones that once echoed with the clank of chains now hum with whispered prayers. This is the alchemy of human storytelling, turning despair into devotion, punishment into pilgrimage. Across centuries and continents, we've seen how myths don't just decorate history, they rewrite it, bending the arc of suffering toward something resembling grace. From the Mamertine's legendary spring to the ghostly graffiti of Sicilian dungeons, these stories share a common thread. They answer our desperate need to believe that no darkness is absolute, that even the most brutal spaces can be cracked open by light. But this transformation isn't simple magic. It's a negotiation between memory and meaning, between the wounds we inherit and the salves we invent. Consider the weight of that negotiation. When pilgrims kneel in a cell where saints supposedly walked, are they honoring history or overwriting it? The Lyon crypts hold bones fractured by Roman torture, yet their display cases gleam under spotlights like reliquaries. Robben Island's limestone quarry, where Mandela's eyesight was stolen by glare, now hosts choirs singing of reconciliation. These sites don't erase suffering, they frame it, offering a lens that lets us stare into the abyss without being swallowed whole. That's the paradox at the heart of every sanctified prison. The myths that heal us also risk obscuring the very truths that made healing necessary. Yet dismissing these stories as mere fiction misses their profound utility. A Sicilian grandmother lighting a candle where heretics scratched crosses into plaster isn't just performing ritual, she's stitching herself into a lineage of resilience. The Japanese origami cranes left at Heimji's suicide tower aren't naive. They're acts of defiance against despair's finality. These narratives, however embellished, become tools for survival, letting communities carry unbearable history without being crushed by its weight. But here's the thorn at the heart of the rose. When does redemption become evasion? The same tales that comfort descendants of the oppressed can inadvertently absolve the oppressors. Tourists snapping selfies in Cape Town's slave castle often leave grappling with unsettling questions. Does calling a dungeon holy soften the horror of what happened there? Can a shrine memorialize pain without sanitizing it? There are no easy answers, only the quiet understanding that these sites hold multitudes. They are classrooms and confessionals, monuments and warnings all at once. So where does that leave us, the inheritors of these layered legacies? Perhaps with a call to hold space for both the myth and the mortar. To walk these corridors with open eyes, honoring the stories that heal, but never letting them wholly eclipse the truths that haunt. After all, the same impulse that turns prisons into shrines also lives in us, the stubborn refusal to let suffering be the end of the story. And so we're left with one final question, not just for these stones, but for ourselves. If stories have the power to sanctify, what stories will we choose to tell about the prisons of our own making, literal or metaphorical? The comment section is open, the conversation just beginning, because the most miraculous transformation isn't in the past, it's in the telling, the listening, the collective act of reaching, always reaching for life.